Iraq is in the grip of deadly anti-government protests, with 240 people killed so far this month. Latest reports say masked gunmen opened fire on protesters in the holy city of Karbala, killing 18 of them. In the capital, Baghdad, meanwhile, demonstrators are defying a curfew. They say they won't leave the streets until an emergency government is put in place. They are calling for an end to corruption and inequality. Some reports say security forces are firing tear gas canisters directly at protesters.
Protesters in Baghdad trying to reach the palaces of power and get as far as the bridge. Across the river sits the Iraqi capital's heavily fortified international zone where government buildings are housed. This time, security forces fire tear gas at the marchers, but they have been using live ammunition for weeks, adding to the rising death toll. Officials confirmed that masked, armed forces fired on protesters on Monday night.
We are peaceful demonstrators. Those rulers harm the Iraqi people. No salaries, no appointments, no plot of land. Their promises are lies. And now they're hitting us with tear gas.
There are no job opportunities here. They stay at home without a hope. The leaderless protests cut across all society, drawing in men and women, secular and religious groups. On another day, these young Iraqis could have been studying to become clerics in the holy city of Najaf, but instead they are out on the street.
The scientific seminary and its students and teachers declare their solidarity with the peaceful demonstrators. We tell the corrupt politicians, get out. This is the demand of the Iraqi people. We don't want them. The corrupt should get out.
The protesters are angry about what they see as government corruption and a lack of basic services and widespread unemployment. They want the government to step down and have already rejected a package of government reforms. Over the weekend, Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi said anyone disrupting businesses and schools would be punished, but it seems unlikely that this will deter the protesters.
And there's been no let-up in unrest in Iraq. Aya Ibrahim from our Arabic department is here with me in the studio to provide some of the backstory. Aya, tell us first, what's behind the anger of these protests that we see now happening in Iraq?
Well, Leila, these protests are not something that started today, yesterday, or even the day before. These are ongoing protests that were sparked actually at the beginning of October this month with the sort of sudden sacking of a very popular wartime military official. This was the spark. This anger then developed into anger at Iraq's ailing public services, the high unemployment, the situation of young people there, and these grievances have basically pushed the anger throughout. And now we are reaching towards the end of the month. These are all very legitimate demands. Iraq is one of the highest producers of oil in the world, yet you have rife unemployment, poverty, etc. But also the security situation is quite bad. We're 2 years after the defeat, the so-called defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq, and the security situation is still very volatile. Young people are fed up by this. I reported from Iraq about 2 years ago, and the demands that young people told me then they wanted are still not being heard today on the streets of Baghdad.
So a lot of very legitimate grievances that the demonstrators have. We've seen a lot of protests in recent years in Iraq. What makes these different, though?
You're right. Iraq is no stranger to mass protests. The last was in the southern city of Basra. This was in September last year, so a little over a year ago. 30 people died then. The difference this time is the geographical spread of them. You see them across Iraq, in the north, in the south, in the central states as well. They're certainly the deadliest. I mean, we've seen since the beginning of the month the death of about 200 people. But we need to unpack this violence a little bit. It's not just government forces against the protesters. Iraq is a country rife with militias. So in situations like this creates opportunity for them to also sort of flex their muscles on the streets and attack the protesters to show their strength to the various political parties that they're aligned with. But I think the main difference is that the people this time don't seem to be deterred by this violence at all. They are going onto the streets knowing that it could be their last day. They could die on the street. They feel like they have nothing more to lose. You know, the country since 2003 has been in turmoil, and they're done with the sectarianism that they see, that many of the protesters have told me have completely torn this country apart.
Yes, they tore the country asunder. Now, how united is this protest movement? Who is leading it?
This is a fairly leaderless movement. It doesn't really have a particular figurehead that is at the forefront. I think, you know, even if we're looking at these protests in comparison to what is happening in Lebanon at the moment, there are a lot of comparisons. And certainly, it's quite an evolution, I think, from what happened in 2011, because the people are not calling for the removal of a figurehead anymore. They have seen that if you remove a figurehead, this doesn't mean that the system will go. And if the system, the infrastructure that has created these figureheads still exists, you will just reproduce new ones. So the people are united in this kind of clarion call. You know, all of these parties, all of these people, they have to go. You know, we heard it in the report that led into this. The corrupt must go. If you are corrupt, must go. And this is, I think, the main difference. Whether that will actually translate into politics is an entirely different story. This is a very entrenched political system, very much rooted in sectarian division. So we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out.
Which makes it so much more complicated and explosive at the same time. Eya Ibrahim reporting. Thank you, as always.